In this lesson, I'm going to talk to you about the cell communication lab and give a better explanation of what's going to actually occur. So for this lab, we're going to be working with yeast. Their scientific name is Saccharomyces cerevisiae. The type of yeast that we're working with is just like regular baker's yeast, but we will have two different strains of the yeast. There's an A type and there's an alpha type. Those are two different mating types, so when they come in contact with each other, they will try to mate. Typically, yeast cells reproduce asexually, meaning they only have one parent, by a process called budding. You can see in the picture below to the right that the budding haploid cells are highlighted with the dark black arrows. So you can see there's a single yeast cell with a tiny little yeast cell growing off of it. This is the process called budding. So budding actually occurs by mitosis. The chromosomes are copied directly, and all of the offspring that come from the process of budding are going to be exactly the same as the parent cells. However, yeast can also sexually reproduce when they detect pheromones released by the other mating strain of yeast. Typically, sexual reproduction is a little bit more advantageous than asexual reproduction because it increases genetic variety in organisms. And when you increase genetic variety, you increase chances of survival because there's new organisms with new traits. So the yeast will sexually reproduce when they can do so. The chromosome number in yeast, we have to talk about that for a second because we're going to be talking about cells going from diploid to haploid and back to diploid again. So yeast can actually alternate between the diploid cell and the haploid cell phases. And diploid cells are cells containing a full set of chromosomes that were contributed by each parent. For example, all of your cells in your body are diploid cells. They have 46 chromosomes in them. But each of your parents' gametes that contributed to you, gametes are sex cells, egg and sperm, each one of those cells were actually haploid cells containing 23 chromosomes each. And when the egg and the sperm of the parents come together to form a zygote, you're going to have the full set of 46 chromosomes again. With yeast, the diploid cells will have 32 chromosomes, and haploid cells, which contain half the number of chromosomes as a diploid cell in an organism, for yeast are going to have 16 chromosomes. So you can see here in this picture on the right, the top part shows asexual reproduction. So it shows maybe an alpha type, which is the one that they're following through here. The alpha type is just going to bud off another alpha type that's genetically identical to the parent, and the cycle is going to continue. But if you put the alpha type in contact with the A type of yeast, then they're going to sexually reproduce. So if the top right of the picture you can see shmoo formation where the cells are going to start growing towards one another, the A and the alpha growing towards each other. And once they come together, they're going to fuse. So there's a dotted line on this picture here to the right where it shows the difference between the haploid portion of the yeast life cycle and the diploid portion. So during, again, sexual reproduction, when the alpha and the A type of yeast cell come together, they form what is called a diploid zygote. So now with the diploid zygote, that's going to actually have 32 chromosomes as opposed to each of the separate types on their own only having 16 chromosomes. Then if a diploid zygote, if it can continue budding, it will if there's enough nutrients in the area, if the conditions are proper for budding. A diploid zygote are going to keep budding off because having more chromosomes, if it doesn't affect the organism, is actually more advantageous because some more of the better traits will be expressed over the traits that are not so good. So the yeast is going to continue budding off of its zygote, its diploid zygote, if it can. And this will keep producing organisms that have a combination of chromosomes from both the alpha and the A type of yeast. However, if conditions become not ideal, if the environment becomes too harsh for the yeast, then a process called sporulation will occur, in which a diploid yeast cell will undergo a process called meiosis, which forms gamete cells that are haploid, meaning they have half the number of chromosomes as the original cell. So meiosis actually is just like mitosis, except it occurs in two divisions. The first division is going to separate the chromosome number and reduce it down to half. And then the second division is going to actually separate all the chromatids that were duplicated before meiosis into the gamete cells. So then you have, once sporulation occurs, then you have haploid spore cells that are located in an ascus. And you can see in this picture the ascus is on the left-hand side of the picture directly beneath the dotted line. So the ascus is containing the haploid spore cells of the yeast. Now again, those spore cells, they can undergo the process of budding in order to create more yeast, new organisms. But again, if the two different types of yeast are going to come in contact with one another, they're going to try to sexually reproduce because that is advantageous. New traits are better for a population. So how exactly do yeast cells sexually reproduce? You can see in this picture over to the right, the blue yeast cell is the A-type yeast and the red is the alpha-type yeast. The A-type yeast is going to release pheromones that the alpha-type yeast can pick up. So you can see the alpha-type yeast actually has those blue pheromones attached to it coming from the A-type yeast. Then the alpha-type yeast releases those pheromones that the A-type can pick up and detect. So once they realize that these two different strains of yeast cells are in close proximity to each other, schmoo cells are going to start to form, which you can see again is the cells starting to grow towards one another. Once those two different haploid cells, remember they have half the number of chromosomes as a rhinodil diploid cell, once they fuse, they form a diploid cell, which in the case of yeast is going to have 32 chromosomes.